Hello. Good morning. I'm here to talk to you about the third decade of open source. It seems strange to imagine, but open source has been around for 20 years. The open source initiative was started at the beginning of February in 1998. And we're going to be having a birthday party at FOSDEM next year. So I hope you're going to come along and celebrate with us. We're actually planning a year of rolling birthday parties so as to outdo OW2. Because you've just got 2 days of birthday party. We're going to have a whole year. So let's talk about the third decade of open source. To do that, we've got to ask ourselves how we got here. How did we get to where we are today? So the way that we got to where we are today is we started out by being laughed at. Open source started in 1998. It started in 1998 as an antidote to Richard Stallman's approach to free software. This is not because free software is not the right answer. Free software is exactly the right answer. It's just that in the Anglophone world, calling it free software is a mistake. Because everybody who hears you say free software, if they have English as a first language, they immediately want to talk to you about money and not about freedom. And it was impossible to explain this to Richard. He simply laughed at us when we said that we need to use the phrase open source instead of free software. He said free software is much more accurate. And we said, yes, Richard, you're right. It is much more accurate, but unfortunately it needs much more explaining as well, because the word free comes with an assumed meaning to everybody who speaks English. It's all about zero price. So we started the open source movement, and the next thing that happened was people started to fight us. In particular, we had companies that were from the Unix world who decided they were going to try and take the opportunity that open source was creating and turn it into hostile revenue. And we also had, and this is a more subtle picture, we also had companies like Microsoft fighting us because they realized that their approach to monetization had no future in a world where everything was open source. Now this photograph I took in Copenhagen, this is one of a kind. You'll probably never see this happen again. This is a public protest by open source geeks against OXML and its ratification at ISO. And the street was full of geeks waving banners, protesting against Microsoft and asking the European Commission to intervene. And so this is a historic photo, the first and probably the last ever open source street protest. So we've come on from there because now after 20 years we've won. How do I know we've won? Well, Apache software is now running pretty much every piece of infrastructure in the world. And on top of Apache software, there is software from OpenStack. And those two are really in control of the world's infrastructure. They're not in control of the world's personal computers, although you'd be surprised. You're running all these laptops and you're running software that's hosted by companies like Google. Well, all of that software on your desktop is open source software. It's just that it's running on an open source CPU somewhere else. The thing that's hosting your session may be proprietary on your computer here, but the software you're running is all open source. The truth is, the year of the open source desktop was about 10 years ago. We've all been running open source desktops for a decade now. It's just we mistake them for web browsers. And then it's very clear in enterprise use that open source has won. The Future of Open Source survey this year basically says that anybody who has got an operating brain recognizes they have open source in their business and need more of it. So what's really worrying is that there are 10% of the people interviewed by this survey who haven't worked out that they're stupid yet. And then there's this. Now, actually, I don't believe this. I don't believe Microsoft does love Linux. I believe that Microsoft is still applying their patent portfolio to tax Linux and to put out of business anyone who competes using it. But they do depend on it for Azure. And consequently, it's in their interests to say that they love it at the moment. But this could never have happened in the past. So first of all, open source was laughed at 20 years ago. Then open source was fought against 10 years ago. And now it's won. Now, why did it work? I'd like to suggest to you some reasons why open source worked. The first one is that the free software idea is to talk about ethics. It is to talk about the right of people to have freedoms. But businesses aren't people. Businesses are sets of processes. People have ethics and morals. Companies are just powered by animal instincts. They're powered by fear, a fear of competition, and they're powered by a need to generate revenue. And anything which is not about mitigating fear or mitigating hunger is of no interest to a corporation. It's of interest to you as an employee of that corporation. Morals and ethics matter to you, but they don't matter to a company. All that matters is whether it's operating to its business principles. And open source took free software and turned it into something that could be measured against revenue and could be measured against market control. And people embraced open source while they claimed to reject free software. What they didn't realize was they were accepting free software all along, because open source has always been free software repackaged. Secondly, I used to work at IBM a long time ago, and one of the things I worked on was code reuse. Code reuse has been a desire of geeks who are about to retire for the whole of the history of computing. We've always wished people would reuse. But software engineers don't want to reuse because they know they will have to adapt. And they've found that learning someone else's code and then adapting it is slower than writing it from the beginning. Now, what open source lets you do is it lets you start with other people's code and adapt it, and then let the adaptation go back into the core product so somebody else maintains your changes. And it turns out that attribute appeals to every geek. Every geek wants to invent something new, but no geek wants to maintain the thing they invented. And so open source encourages reuse by taking away the maintenance of change. And that's the second reason it succeeded. The third reason it succeeded is because it had OSI behind it. Now, you may not see OSI in the news every day, but OSI is doing some important things for you all the time. First of all, what OSI is doing is OSI is helping consensus about open source issues crystallize. So what we do is we let, for example, the license review mailing list discuss a new open source license. And we then crystallize the consensus, we remember the consensus, and we protect the consensus. So Patrick Masson, who's our general manager, spends a lot of time writing letters to companies who say their code is open source, but is not under an open source license. He spends a lot of time looking for people who are using this trademark and are not using it in a way that represents software freedom. So we quietly patrol the perimeter of open source, and we ensure that people discover that the consensus of the community is that this logo means software freedom. And in the cases where it doesn't, you'll hear from us. I think those are the three reasons open source has succeeded. It has been able to create a path of least resistance for enterprises to adopt free software. It has been able to encourage developers that free software is the way to go rather than building new. And it has been able to protect the boundaries of that consensus and prevent it from becoming corrupted. All of those are very subtle things, but I believe that they carry forward into the future of open source. So here's my views about the trends that are going to affect us for the next 10 years. First of all, I think we're going to see community divergence. Now, the history of free software and open source has been to start with the end user and the hobbyist. And then commercial use of software has always been permitted, but has always been the second case. And then enterprise deployment has been an afterthought. And that has gradually changed over the last 20 years. And I believe over the next 10, we'll see much more of a divergence between projects which are aimed and staffed mainly by hobbyists. I think we'll see those projects being casual projects or at charitable hosts like Software Freedom Conservancy. Then we'll see professional specialist projects, such as the kind that OW2 works on, but also projects like OpenStack, which are projects where the companies involved focus mainly on that particular piece of software. They're not projects that are typically used in combination with many, many other portions to make a deployment. They're typically projects that are a big topic in their own right. And I think we'll see those working within charity consortia, like OW2, like the Apache Software Foundation in America. And then finally, I think we'll see the rise of professional generalists. I think hobbyists were the first decade of open source. I think professional specialists were the second decade of open source. And the third decade of open source will see the rise of the professional generalist. People who work for Orange and integrate a complete stack of open source software to deliver a solution. People who work within a community like Eclipse, which has many tools that can be used to produce integrated solutions. I think that the professional generalists will tend not to be paid to create direct wealth from open source, but rather to solve wealth-creating problems using open source. And so I think this is going to be an important trend over the next decade, the move towards professional generalists in open source. And I would note that professional generalists very much need software freedom, but we'll come back to that. This will come as bad news to the people in the room who work for single project companies, but I don't think there are going to be any more of them. I think that I do still hear people debating open source business models, but they are typically people who made their career debating open source business models and have never had a second idea. And today, no one really cares about open source business models. No one cares about your open source business model, because open source is not about business models anymore. Open source companies today are companies that integrate many projects. They're companies that take an open source framework and use it with an open source programming language and combine it with an open source server and an open source messaging solution. And they use open source DevOps tools, and they use open source load balancing tools, and everything is open source. But the people who work with it are not about any one of those projects. They are about the whole solution. And today, successful open source companies are companies that integrate lots of things. So I would categorize Google as a successful open source company, because everything inside their boundary is open source, but nothing they deliver to their customer is open source. I think that the way that open source companies will differentiate in this next decade is by the management of complexity. One of my favorite companies is CloudBees. CloudBees works on a project that was at Sun called Jenkins. And you could think of CloudBees as a Jenkins company. But really they're not. They're really a management of complexity company that delivers developer solutions using a stack of open source software, of which Jenkins is one of the parts. And I think that's characteristic of the next decade's open source companies. They will be managing complexity for their clients. I think that in the future we'll see also it is deployers that are driving project life cycles. In the previous 2 decades of open source, it was the delivery priorities of the developers that drove open source life cycles. But I think that in the next decade, it will be deployers that are driving project life cycles. And that's why I expect to see a release train model becoming more and more the norm. It's already pretty much the norm in the projects I look at. I don't think we will see very many people tolerating a when it's ready model for delivery anymore. Because as a deployer, you want to know what the release dates are for your stack, and you preferably want them to all be predictable and aligned. That's one of the reasons Linux succeeded for the enterprise infrastructure stack. It was because you knew when everything was going to be ready, and you knew how it was all going to be deployed. It was all very predictable. I think that from an open source perspective, we're going to see licensing consolidation continue to advance. I don't think we want your new open source licenses, thank you. Please don't write any new ones, because OSI is going to give you hell if you do. You better have a really, really good reason why you're submitting a new license to us, because we will very politely tell you exactly how much you're valued when you show up on the license review list with your license. Now, there are a few exceptions to that. We welcome the new Eclipse license, for example, because it fixes the old Eclipse license. We're quite happy to have people fix old licenses, especially if they deprecate the old ones rather than just keep them for old time's sake. I think that we're going to see compatibility families of licensing dominate. So I don't think it's going to matter very much which license you pick, but it is going to matter that it's compatible with the family of licenses that your deployers use in their stack. So if the stack that's being deployed is a GPL stack, really you need to use a GPL compatible license. Novelty is of no interest, because what matters is that me managing the compliance of my stack is going to be far more important than the license preferences that you had. So I think compatibility families will dominate licensing. I think we're going to discover a new enemy, and it is attribution. The enemy up until now has not been attribution, it has been reciprocity. Everybody has been afraid of the GPL. The reason everyone is afraid of the GPL is their corporate counsel has told them that the developers will accidentally give away all the company's IP. And they can't be allowed anywhere near that dangerous GPL thing that is going to give away all the company's IP. So just don't allow it. But it turns out open source licenses have requirements other than reciprocity. By reciprocity, I mean copyleft. They have terms other than reciprocity. The most important one is attribution. So for example, the BSD license seems so simple, and yet it says that you have to give attribution, you have to reproduce the copyright statement and disclaimer of the BSD license as modified by each individual geek in the documentation for whatever you ship to your customers. Now, satisfying that attribution requirement is a very unpleasant engineering task. Tracking the exact generation of each line of code in your product and making sure there is attribution for it is a terrible task. Go look in iTunes and go look for the About area and go look in the licensing section, and you will see page after page after page after page of slightly different BSD, MIT, ISC, and Apache licenses going past for every line of code that they've incorporated in iTunes. And I believe that we've come to terms with reciprocity. We know how to manage GPL now. It is a very simple task to manage GPL in your product, particularly if your product is not being shipped to anybody. But maintaining attribution is a nightmare. It is a terrible thing to have to do. And I think we will see people begin to say, oh, we're using the GPL because of the compliance issues with the BSD license. You heard it here first. And as I say, we're not going to approve any new licenses, so please don't try. And if you want later, I'll explain to you the mechanisms we're going to use to stop you writing new licenses, but that's what they are. And then, now it turns out that software freedom was what open source was always about. I was reading some of the reasons RMS doesn't like the term open source, and he says it's because we never talk about freedom. Well, I'd like to correct that misapprehension, Richard, if you're watching. We do talk about freedom all the time. Software freedom is very important to human beings. And it is the goal of open source is to make sure that freedom is available to as many human beings as possible. And we have cunningly exploited a weakness in corporations to make sure that software freedom is available to everyone on the planet for huge amounts of software. But it turns out that software freedom is the most important thing. Open source is not just a methodology. It is a way of having the lowest friction, lowest impact way of ensuring software freedom. If you take the approach of software freedom being a personal choice, like FSF does, you have to evaluate every license and every program to check its software freedom profile. And because that's a hard task, you have to empower an individual to tell you whether or not this is free software. But the open source approach is to leave it to consensus. It's to leave it to the community consensus to say whether this is free software, and is to remember the consensus, to attach the consensus to the license, and then to give people the confidence to innovate without needing to ask permission first. Those core freedoms, however, matter. If you didn't have the freedom to use the software for any purpose, you would have to ask for permission to use the software, and you could not innovate. If you did not have the freedom to review the source code of the software, you would have to ask for it. You would have to gain permission. And you would consequently not be free to innovate and to deploy and to change. If you had to ask for permission to pass the software on to other people, then you would not be free to innovate. You would not be free to build community. You would not be free to have diverse communities of deployment and use. All the things you value about open source flow from those core 4 freedoms. And if you didn't have them, then all of those methodological ideas about open source would never apply. And I think we're going to rediscover that during this decade, because those core freedoms drive business values and they unify engagement so that people can collaborate in a community without having to fear the other collaborators. Software freedom delivers better results. And that's why, if you're coming up with a strategy and you're trying to work out what you should do in your strategy, I recommend you as a human apply software freedom first, as your first guess. Do the thing that creates more software freedom, and then look around to see whether that's the right business solution. And you'll find in almost every case that opting for software freedom gives you the best first guess for a business decision. Too many people make a business decision and then try to fit the software freedom later, and trust me, that often fails. And then in the next decade, and I would say this because they are paying for my travel, OSI is more relevant than ever. I'd encourage you to become individual members of OSI in this, our 20th anniversary year. We are continuing to engage in license stewardship. During the first decade of open source, that was, oh, I wonder how we do license stewardship. During the second decade, it was, bring your licenses, we want them. And in the third decade, it is, no more licenses, please, we have plenty. More importantly, I think, than license stewardship, which I think you understand, is bridging communities. We bridge open source communities. We bridge every open source community. We go out drinking with the leaders of open source communities, don't we, Cedric? We make sure that everybody knows everybody else, and that the opportunity for disunity is as small as possible. It's a quiet role, and it requires you to have a strong liver, but it is very, very important to the future of open source. And we'll carry on confirming, recording, and protecting consensus, sometimes in new areas. We'll be doing this around new projects within OSI's incubator. If you've got a new idea about something that doesn't involve writing code, maybe it's a travel fund for independent developers, maybe it is a new international magazine for developers, maybe it is an academic curriculum for open source. If you've got a non-code idea, we would like to host it. We would like to confirm the consensus of the group of people you have working on it, record that consensus and make it available to others, and then protect it from abuse because we discovered that consensus is valuable. So we're coming into the third decade now of open source. And I see a bright future. I see this is a moonrise, which I still love. I think we're seeing a new day dawning. And remember that the new day starts at the end of the old day. The new day starts on February the 2nd next year. And the old day is currently in progress. So thank you very much for listening, and I wish you a very profitable and enjoyable third decade of open source.